we're going to take a side on the rent versus buy. Your plan should not be to rent forever. That is not a plan, that is a gamble. Now, our investment journey in real estate started with a lease option, using the money that we made with that to buy our first condo. And after that condo, we bought a house. And then after that house, we bought 2 more condos. And then after those 2 more condos, we bought a countryside home in Portugal. And then after that countryside home in Portugal, we bought a villa, a tiny home. We own a beach house. And now, a lake house. You see, all of these home acquisitions would not have been possible if we had have been thinking of renting our entire life. Hey guys, it's Aman from Our Rich Journey, and welcome to my series where I call out some of the worst financial advice sweeping the internet. On today's video, we are talking about the rent for life advice that is taking over the internet. Now, you will hear these online gurus, these bloggers, these vloggers, these YouTubers say this with a straight face, that renting is better than buying. We call these the rent forever gurus. And they don't always come right out and say it like that. They mask it with different types of slogans or phrases. They say things like, buying a home doesn't make sense right now. Sounds rational, but often it's used to justify never buying. They say it's smarter to rent and invest the difference. Sounds like a plan, but most people never actually invest the difference. They say renting gives you more freedom, and that sounds empowering. But in reality, renters have less control, not more. They say a house is a liability and not an asset. Now that sounds clever, but tell that to the millions of people who built their wealth through home equity. And this is the one that gets a lot of people. They say not everyone should own a home. Now that sounds inclusive, but it's keeping people stuck with nothing to show for decades of rent. Now, all of these slogans sound smart, they sound modern, they sound liberating, but let me be real with you. They are a part of one of the biggest financial lies sweeping the internet. And this bad advice is stopping so many people from pursuing the one goal that can actually give them financial security, owning their own home. So in this episode, I'm going to break down the renting versus buying debate and explain why the advice to just rent is keeping people broke, how we use strategic home buying to build wealth, and how you can buy a home even in a market that feels out of reach. So if you've ever wondered, should I rent forever? This video is for you. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see why that isn't just bad advice, it is financial sabotage. So let's get into it. So first, let's talk about why this advice sounds so good, but in reality, it fails. Now, to be fair, it sounds really smart on the surface when you're talking about some of the reasons to rent versus buy. I mean, there are things like you'll have more flexibility if you rent. You won't be tied down. It's cheaper to rent in big cities. But here's the thing. All of these arguments are based on short-term thinking. They compare rent versus mortgage in year 1, monthly costs without considering future equity, flexibility while ignoring the instability of being a tenant. And the people that are giving this advice, they are thinking like consumers and not investors. But when you think like an investor, your home ownership journey can look a lot like ours. Now, our investment journey in real estate started with a lease option. Buying a home with a lease option and then reselling that lease option contract to someone else for a profit, using the money that we made with that to buy our first condo, a small condo in San Diego. And after that condo, we bought a house. And then after that house, we bought 2 more condos. And then after those 2 more condos, we bought a countryside home in Portugal. And then after that countryside home in Portugal, we bought a villa, a tiny home. We own a beach house, and now a lake house. You see, all of these home acquisitions would not have been possible if we had have been thinking of renting our entire life. We would not have been able to ladder up in that way. And what you'll notice about our journey is we didn't jump right into luxury. We use every property as a stepping stone. We bought smart, we added value, we sold, we created rental properties, we reinvested, and along the way, our equity kept growing while our cost of living stayed under control. That's the power of owning strategically and not emotionally. So that's our story, but let's dig down deeper into what the internet is lying to you about. You see, the internet loves to tell a one-sided story with numbers that aren't realistic when you look at them over the long run. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's take New York City, for example, one of the most expensive cities in the world to buy a home in, and also one of the most expensive cities in the world to rent a home in. But these financial gurus will tell you that even in New York, it is much better to rent than it is to own. You should rent forever in New York City if you plan on living there forever. Well, let's take a look at that scenario. Let's say in New York City, your rent might be $3,000 a month. That same apartment next door might cost you $6,000 a month to own it. Now, at first glance, this sounds insane. To own that same home costs double than it is to rent it. But here's what the internet is not telling you. Rent goes up every single year in New York City. That mortgage, that stays the same. And after 15, 20, 30 years, that owner is mortgage free. On the other hand, that renter is still paying rent after decades and decades. And more than likely, that rent is far higher than that mortgage would have been. You see, rent is never fixed. Even in rent control situation, the rent still goes up. You see, across the world, it is very, very rare to have your rent never change. Rent goes up. But a mortgage, that's locked in. And eventually, it's gone. You see, the owner builds equity, the renter builds nothing. But some of you are still going to argue that owning a home is a struggle. But I have a strategy to propose. Now look, I'm not saying go out, buy a brand new house with a gourmet kitchen and an ocean view. I'm saying buy like an investor in those high cost of living places like New York City, like San Francisco, like Lisbon, Portugal. And so what does that mean when you buy like an investor? Well, it means doing some of the things that we did. For one, buying a fixer-upper. 2, house hacking. Rent out a room or a separate unit. 3, buy below market. Or 4, relocate to an area that makes financial sense. And what's important to recognize is that you don't have to buy your forever home right away. You just need to get in the game, like we did in our situation. By buying our first modest condo, that set the tone for building equity and building wealth to be able to ladder up. You see, this is something the financial gurus never talk about. Once you buy your first piece of real estate, it allows you to build equity, to be able to ladder up, to be able to acquire more properties. One of my financial mantras when it comes to renting versus buying is that renting keeps you chasing and owning lets you lead. And what I mean by this is, let's say you keep renting. Your landlord raises the rent 5 to 10% a year. Your income, maybe it raises 2 to 3% per year. You're working harder just to stay in the same place, literally. Meanwhile, the landlord is building equity off of your payments. But some of you are still not sure. Well, check out this statistic when it comes to renters versus owners. Here's what the Federal Reserve says. The median net worth of a homeowner is over 40 times higher than a renter. Not 40% higher, 40 times higher than a renter. You see why the rent forever financial advice is so bad? And the crazy part is the gap keeps growing because real estate is a wealth building machine. Buying a home can make you wealthier than almost any renter simply because you own an appreciating asset and they don't. And I know a lot of you are going to say, but Aman, I can't afford to buy a home. You can't afford to buy a home right now, but your plan should be to eventually buy a home one day. Your plan should not be to rent forever. That is not a plan. That is a gamble. So the final truth is, owning a home is really a part of building a life of freedom. The Rent Forever financial gurus will say that renting gives you freedom. But I've seen what freedom really looks like. It's owning your home outright, having no landlord to answer to, knowing your costs won't spike next year, having a place that's yours no matter what happens. Freedom isn't being able to move every 12 months. Freedom is not having to move at all unless you decide. So if you've been told that renting is better than buying, question it. The truth is, owning gives you financial security. Investing in the stock market gives you financial independence. And you need both on this financial independence retire early journey. So I hope you guys have liked this first episode where I expose the worst financial advice online. If there's something else that you guys want me to talk about in this series, let me know. I would be happy to explain in more detail how some of this advice can lead you astray on your financial independence journey. And so if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and join the journey.